In the late summer of 1883, a Lakota elder at the Pine Ridge Agency in Dakota Territory agreed, for the first time in his life, to describe to a white man the specific passages his people called the Onka Ikiapi, a phrase that translates most accurately, though imperfectly, as the places that hold what should not be said. He was approximately 70 years old. He had refused similar requests, through interpreters, at least 3 times over the preceding decade. The man he finally agreed to speak to was not a soldier, not a government administrator, not an agent pressing him for land or labor. He was James Owen Dorsey, an ethnologist working under contract to the Bureau of American Ethnology, and he had been sitting quietly at Pine Ridge for 11 weeks before the elder came to find him. The conversation lasted 2 days. Dorsey recorded it in a separate notebook from the one he used for his official field observations, a private ledger, not submitted with his bureau reports, not referenced in any of his published monographs on the Lakota or Omaha or Ponca. What that ledger contained did not surface in any archive until 1971, when a member of the Dorsey family included it in an estate sale lot. It was purchased for 65 cents. The buyer did not know what he had. I found the ledger through a footnote in something else. I was reading a 1974 master's thesis on Bureau of American Ethnology field methods, held in the George Washington University Library, and the thesis author had consulted the ledger briefly, cited it in passing for a single detail about Lakota naming conventions, and moved on. She gave it a descriptive title and a box number in the Smithsonian Institution archives. I requested it in 2019. It arrived as a photocopy of 47 handwritten pages. The first 31 are routine field observations, kinship terms, seasonal vocabulary, descriptions of winter count pictographs. Page 32 is where the elder begins to speak about the hills. And the first thing he said, as Dorsey recorded it, was that he was speaking now because he believed the passages would be entered by government surveyors within 5 years regardless, and he preferred that someone know what was in them before the entering happened. He was not wrong about the timeline. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what the elder described, why the silence had been maintained for as long as it had, and why the physical evidence for what he described was recorded by at least 3 separate federal surveys, in 1875, 1893, and 1902, each of which noted the same anomalies, and each of which placed its most significant observations in sections of the report filed separately from the published findings. I want to be clear about what I can show you and what I cannot establish. I cannot prove what the passages contained at the time the elder spoke. What I can show you is a documented convergence across 4 archives, across nearly 3 decades of federal survey activity, across the testimony of a man who had spent his life refusing to speak. That points consistently toward the same conclusion. Something was in the Black Hills before the Lakota arrived. The Lakota knew it. They maintained a specific protocol of silence around it. And when the silence finally broke in 1883, the institution it broke toward ensured that the record was kept where it would not easily be found. The Black Hills are already layered in ways the popular understanding does not capture. Pahasapa, the hills that appear black from a distance because of the dense pine canopy, are not incidentally sacred to the Lakota. They are cosmologically central. Wind Cave, Washunia, the cave that breathes, is in Lakota tradition the place of emergence, the opening through which the Lakota people first came into this world from the spirit world below. This is not a general metaphor for the hills as landscape. It is a specific, named, locatable site with a specific theological function, maintained with corresponding protocols across generations. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty guaranteed the hills to the Lakota in perpetuity. The 1874 expedition led by George Armstrong Custer entered the hills illegally, reported gold, and within 2 years the treaty was effectively nullified. By 1883, the legal battle was over. The physical resistance was broken, and the elders who carried the full tradition were watching it compress in real time under the weight of the reservation system, the agency schools, and the systematic suppression of ceremony that characterized federal Indian policy in that decade. The elder who came to find Dorsey in the late summer of 1883 was not broken. He was making a calculation. Consider what he was protecting when he finally chose to speak. The Onka Ikiapi, the places that hold what should not be said, were not a single location. Dorsey's transcription describes a network of passages in the limestone and granite formations of the Central Hills, some natural in origin and modified by human hands over a long period, some apparently constructed in their entirety, all connected in the elder's account by a shared characteristic. They were already present when the Lakota first moved into the Black Hills, which oral tradition places in the early to mid-18th century. The Lakota did not make them. They found them, already finished, already in use for something the elder could only describe by its evidence rather than its purpose. And what the elder described finding inside those passages, in the chambers his lineage had been specifically designated to maintain across generations, was not gold, not weapons, not burial goods. It was, in Dorsey's translation, the marks of the people before, kept the same as the day they were left. Working surfaces, stone arrangements, pigment applied to wall sections in a pattern too deliberate for decoration and too consistent across chambers to be incidental. What Dorsey struggled to render accurately in English and eventually described as prepared chambers with material evidence of sustained occupation and use, predating any known habitation of the region, with a caveat, in a marginal note to himself, that sustained did not capture what the elders seemed to mean, which was something closer to maintained in the same state across time by people who came after, out of an obligation to the people who came before. The question the elders seemed most concerned with was not whether the passages would be discovered. He had already decided they would be. The question he returned to, across both days of the conversation, was whether anyone who found them would understand the protocol. Because the silence had never been about hiding. It had been about preservation, ensuring the chambers remained in a specific condition until people who knew the protocol arrived to maintain them properly. The Lakota keepers had held that condition for a century and a half without knowing whether the people the passages had been made for would ever return. By 1883, the elder had concluded they would not, and so he told Dorsey where the primary entrance was, what the passage sequence looked like from inside, and what the chamber at its deepest navigable point contained. Dorsey wrote it all down. None of it appeared in any publication during Dorsey's lifetime. This is the part I keep returning to. Because the Walter Jenney Geological Expedition, the first systematic survey of the Black Hills, conducted in 1875, commissioned specifically to assess the mineral wealth of the hills for what everyone understood would be the formal seizure to follow, produced survey notes that are held in the records of the U.S. Geological Survey at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. In the personal field log of one of the survey's junior geologists, there is a notation about an anomalous finding near the central limestone formations at approximately 5,200 feet of elevation. The notation describes evidence of prior excavation, walls dressed by tools, not by water, interior chamber of approximately 12 feet by 20 feet in plan, with a prepared stone floor and what appears to be deliberate ventilation through a secondary passage oriented to the northwest. Prior excavation. Walls dressed by tools, not by water. This language does not appear anywhere in Jenney's published report to the government. The published report describes the area's geological formations as commercially promising and makes no reference to worked chambers. The field log containing this description was filed by a different man from the official report. And when the archive was organized in the 1930s, it was not indexed alongside the Jenny report. Connecting it to anything requires knowing to look for it, and knowing to look requires having read page 32 of the Dorsey Ledger first. And there is a second survey. The Bureau of American Ethnology's own fieldwork in the Black Hills region in 1893, conducted 8 years after the Dawes Act, during the period of maximum pressure on Lakota land tenure, produced internal correspondence noting that Lakota guides assigned to the survey party had refused, at a specific location in the Central Hills, to continue into an area they described using a term the field interpreter translated as the kept place. The correspondence is in the Bay Administrative Files at the Smithsonian, Box 31, Folder 12. The survey leader's response was to note the refusal, record the translation, and redirect the party. No follow-up was dispatched. The kept place was not entered, and the correspondence noting its approximate location was filed without cross-reference to the Jenny Field log from 1875, or to the Dorsey Ledger from 1883, or to what the U.S. Geological Survey Cave Assessment Team would record 9 years later. The 1902 report concerns the cave systems of the southern and central Black Hills, a systematic documentation conducted as part of the USC's broader natural resources inventory of the newly consolidated federal land in the hills. The section dealing with the central limestone formations contains an observation on page 41 that the lead surveyor, a man named Harlan Fitch, described in notably careful language for a technical government document. Fitch wrote that certain passages in the examined formations showed surface characteristics inconsistent with formation by water or natural geological process, specifically that wall surfaces bore evidence of sustained abrasion by tools or workstone implements across a considerable vertical extent, suggesting modification over a period of time difficult to estimate without further analysis. He also noted a prepared stone floor in one chamber and a secondary passage oriented, as the 1875 field log had recorded, entirely independently, to the northwest. He did not know about the 1875 field log. Nothing in Fitch's report cites Jenny's survey. 2 separate federal investigators described, without knowledge of each other, the same chamber at the same location. And Fitch's observation appears on page 41 of a report whose published summary is 4 pages long. Page 41 is in the Supplementary Technical Appendix. The Supplementary Appendix was not included in the version of the report distributed to the Department of the Interior. Not distributed, not cited, not connected. And the distinction between a published summary and a Supplementary Technical Appendix is, in the world of federal land management, a meaningful one. The summary is what the Department of the Interior acts on. The appendix is where technically accurate observations go when the people writing the document do not know what to do with them. Fitch knew what he had found. He recorded it with precision. And then he filed it in the section of the report that the people making decisions about the Black Hills were not going to read, because connecting the documents would have created a problem the administrative logic of 1902 could not absorb. By that year, the Black Hills were federal land, and the gold mining operations were at full production. The legal argument for the taking rested in part on the characterization of the hills as territory, without prior claim of civilizational depth. Land whose sacred designation by the Lakota was a matter of recent tradition, rather than ancient occupation, traceable to an unnamed prior people. Evidence of pre-Lakota occupation of constructed chambers in the limestone formations of the Central Hills. Chambers maintained by the Lakota according to a specific inherited protocol across a century and a half, described in consistent terms by a Jenny survey geologist in 1875, a Bay Guide refusal in 1893, and a Usge's cave surveyor in 1902, and documented in extraordinary detail by an elder who had spent his life refusing to speak until 1883, was not a finding that fit the narrative the Department of the Interior had already finalized. So it went into the supplementary appendix. The appendix was not distributed, and Harlan Fitch retired from the Usge's in 1908 without publishing anything further on the subject. The elder who spoke to Dorsey in 1883 was not naive about what would happen to the words he was giving away. He knew Dorsey would write them into a government-adjacent archive. He knew the archive belonged to the institution that had taken the hills. He knew his words would not produce action or restitution. What Dorsey recorded, and this is the passage in the ledger I find myself returning to most often, was the elder's statement that the protocol of silence had never been about secrecy in the ordinary sense. It had been about patience. The understanding, passed from keeper to keeper across generations, that the passages had been made by people who intended to return for them, and that the knowledge of how to maintain them needed to survive intact until that return. The keeping was an act of faithfulness to people the Lakota keepers had never met. By 1883, the elder had concluded that return was not coming in any lifetime he could foresee. And so he made a different kind of record, in a stranger's notebook, in a language not his own, trusting that the record itself might eventually find its way to someone who understood what it described. This was not the only silence broken under similar pressure, and the Black Hills were not the only place where the breaking left a record that has not been assembled. In the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, survey correspondence from the 1870s and 1880s documents repeated refusals by Crow and Eastern Shoshone guides to approach specific high-altitude passages. Refusals described consistently as adherence to old prohibition rather than personal reluctance, and documented in the survey records without follow-up in every case. What the guides were observing, in each instance, was described in their own accounts as the old law, a prohibition inherited, not invented, pointing back towards something that predated the nations currently maintaining it. At Devil's Tower, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa all maintain traditions about passages within or beneath the formation described as having been present before any of those nations took the site into their sacred geography, already there, already in use, already maintained by a protocol none of them had originated. That convergence of independent traditions pointing to the same characteristic, already there, already being kept, older than the current keepers, is not coincidence. It is description. At the cave sites of the Laramie Range, Usge's photography from the 1890s shows worked stone at cave entrances that the accompanying reports describe as possibly of Native American manufacture. The word possibly doing a great deal of institutional work, meaning, we saw this, we noted it, and we chose not to follow where it pointed. What was lost in the Black Hills after 1883 was not only the land, not only the treaty. What was lost was the maintenance itself, the unbroken chain of keepers who understood the protocol, who kept the chambers in the condition the elder described to Dorsey, who knew what kept the same as the day they were left required in practice across 150 years. The knowledge of how to maintain a thing is not separable from the thing being maintained. You cannot strip the keepers from the kept and preserve the kept intact. The elder was the last of his specific lineage to hold the full knowledge of the primary entrance and the passage sequence that followed it. He had no successor. The children who should have learned what he knew were in the agency schools by 1883, learning a different language in rooms designed explicitly to ensure that the knowledge of the previous generation would not complete its passage to the next one. He knew this. Dorsey knew this. The 47 pages of the ledger are the record of a man transmitting everything he had carried across decades of silence into a form that had a chance, however small, of outlasting the system that was in the process of ending the carrying itself. The ledger is in Box 14 of the Dorsey Papers at the Smithsonian Institution Archives. 47 handwritten pages, 31 of them are field notes about kinship terms and seasonal vocabulary. 16 of them are a lifetime silence, surrendered to a stranger across 2 days in the late summer of 1883, because surrender to a page was the last form the keeping could take. If this is something you find yourself needing to share it with someone who has been taught that this continent had no history before European arrival. Because there was history here, it was being kept with great care by people who understood that the keeping was itself a form of faithfulness to something older than any of the nations that came after. What was taken from them was not only the land, it was the right to continue keeping it.